And now I have started recording. Okay. So, a little bit about me first, just so you know my background and why I have the credentials, maybe, to teach some of this stuff and pretend that I know something about this. Just kidding. So, I used to go to college here at Illinois Tech. I graduated in 2023. My major while I was here was computer engineering. I'm also former participant and at one point president of Cyberhawks. And I have Cyberhawks to credit with a lot of where I am today, because I will say most of what I learned that was actually relevant to my field, I did not learn in classes. I learned here doing stuff for fun and participating in competitions. Speaking of competitions, I participated in Hivestorm, Cyberforce, CCDC, and NCAA Cyber Games while I was here. Since then, I became a volunteer at a couple of those competitions. So I made content for the NCAA Cyber Games. When they actually post that on their YouTube, I have no idea, because now it's been a while and they still have not posted it. But I did make that last year. I'm also the red team lead for the Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition, the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic regions. So if you do end up joining CCDC, you will be going against my team, and I am so excited for it. And in addition to that, I pretty regularly come back to give seminars. For example, for the Collegiate Penetration Testing Competition last fall, I guided the team that did that. I've also given a couple conference talks, and I am a private tutor. So that's kind of my volunteer side of things. And then for work, I work at NetSpy is my main job. And then Falcon Ops is kind of like my side job. And I do mostly internal and external penetration testing. And now at NetSpy, I'm moving to purple teaming. At NetSpy, we call it breach and attack simulation. And that's why I decided, since I'm moving to purple teaming, why don't I actually make a presentation or make a seminar series about purple teaming where we get hands-on with it. In addition, I've done red team engagements before. I have the certified red team lead certification, offensive security certified professional certification, and I got to do one physical penetration test, which was really fun. Got to go down to Florida and break into a place. Yes. So that's a little bit about me. And now, this is or will be a seminar series on purple teaming. So it probably makes sense for me to explain what purple teaming is and why it's relevant to you. But in order for me to actually explain that, I have to give you a good amount of context so you understand where purple teaming fits into the cybersecurity landscape. So we're going to start square one. Square one, why do we have the concept of cybersecurity in the first place? Because there are threat actors that abuse vulnerabilities, right? So where do these vulnerabilities come from? I like to organize it into attacking machines and attacking people. So starting with attacking machines, the first thing is when developers are writing code, they aren't necessarily security conscious, right? They're trying to make a product that works. So a lot of the times you'll find bugs in code that then attackers can abuse. That's actually becoming less common nowadays, that people are moving to higher level programming languages like, Python, but lower level programming languages like C or C++ or C#, very memory focused. And so if you aren't conscious of how you're handling that memory, you can get some bugs in code that can be exploited, especially buffer overflows, string format exploits, things like that. All right, so maybe those developers wrote sound code, they passed it on to system administrators, right? And it's up to the administrators to actually set up the infrastructure that the developers developed, right? They're the ones actually using that application. So maybe the developers did a fine job, but the administrators don't fully understand the implications of certain configurations. And so they misconfigure the application, so making it vulnerable in some way. So if you were with me for the CPTC seminar series and you remember all those Active Directory attacks that we did, most of them are the result of misconfiguration, right? Then there are also intended features that can be abused, right? So a good example of that is LLMNR poisoning. LLMNR performs basically DNS resolution when a DNS server does not have a record. I know that was a lot of words if you're new to this, But basically, google.com, you type that into a web browser, that gets translated to the actual address where google.com is located, right? And the way that's done is your machine reaches out to a DNS server and asks for that translation, like says, what's the address, what's the numeric address for google.com, right? Now, if the DNS server does not have a record, then Windows machines and other machines by default will reach out on these broadcast DNS protocols like MDNS, LLM, and they'll ask for if anybody else has that DNS record. Well, an attacker could respond to that and say, hey, I have that DNS record, and here's my address, right? And so subsequent communication happens with the attacker, and then they can collect credentials or things that way. I know if you're new to this and that didn't fully make sense to you, don't worry. I'm just trying to give you examples to show each of these, right? So that's an example of an intended feature that can be abused for the time being. Then the last one is backdoors. And this, sometimes you can hear this called supply chain vulnerabilities. So with any service that you're running on a machine, there's the people who created the hardware. There's the people who created the operating system. There's the people who created the packages that service relies on. There's the people who created that service, right? So if at any point down that chain, somebody had malicious intent, they could put a backdoor in that then they could later leverage when it gets put in production, right? So I like to give the example of last year, there was, I forget which package, SSH, OpenSSH in Linux, a common service in Linux relies on this specific package. Somebody actually backdoored that package and it would allow remote code execution for any Linux server running OpenSSH. Fortunately, I think somebody at Microsoft caught that, and now that's no longer a thing.
It was in the exe package, I think.
Yes, I think you're right about that. Yep. So that's a good, perfect example of a backdoor that's introduced by a threat actor somewhere down the supply chain, right? Then there's attacking people, also known as social engineering. So with social engineering, that's when you try to get somebody, like an actual person, to either enter credentials in a fake login page, run malware on their machine to give you initial access, or provide you with some kind of sensitive information, right? And social engineering can happen at any point in the attacker's process. So when we say sensitive information, it doesn't necessarily have to be convincing somebody to give you their credit card number, right? It could be like, let's say I want to figure out what emails are actually valid at an organization, right? I can email all the potential addresses, and if I see that an employee opens their email, then I know that email is a valid email for the organization. So something that you can do, for example, is you can put like a transparent pixel image, like 1 pixel image in your email that automatically tries to grab that image from a server you're hosting, right? And then that's how you know if they opened the email or not. So just some examples of social engineering, and these are kind of the two different places where we have vulnerabilities that attackers abuse. Does that make sense? Questions so far? All right, so attackers abuse those vulnerabilities to get into your infrastructure. How do they do that? Well, here are the stages of an attack. The first one is reconnaissance and vulnerability identification. So actually, about 75 or 80% of an attack is actually spent in this stage, not actually getting on your system, but learning about your infrastructure. So that could be active scanning, figuring out what services you have running on your machines. That could be performing open source intelligence, gathering information about employees to potentially target them in a social engineering attack, right? So that's the more that an attacker knows about their target, the more successful they are with their attacks, and the more they know like what they can abuse to actually get in. So that's where we have this first stage, reconnaissance and vulnerability identification. Then from there, we have initial access. So In initial access, that's where the attacker actually gets into your environment, right? A lot of the times that's with social engineering, convincing somebody to run malware, right? That provides initial access. But there are other ways, of course, like maybe they abused a vulnerable web application that's external facing, but then that provides a foothold into the internal network because that web application is on a server that has access to the internet and also internally, right? Then from there, I put this as an optional, but if an attacker wants to stay on your machines for an extended period of time and have a way of communicating back and forth with those machines, they do something called command and control. Command and control is maintaining access to your machines and being able to run things on them for an extended period of time, and it follows the specific procedure that we're actually going to talk about in the next slide. The reason I say this is optional is because it depends on the attacker's goals. Let's say it's just a ransomware, right? Well, then maybe they don't spawn this command and control session. Maybe they instead encrypt your files and demand payment, right? So command control is not a requirement, but as an attacker, you oftentimes want that back and forth communication with the machines that you're able to get on, right? Okay, then privilege escalation and lateral movement is the process of gaining greater privileges to the thing that you compromised, right? So let's say I got in your internal network and I have and I'm running as a low privilege user, right? But I don't have full control over that machine, right? So maybe I'll escalate privileges on that individual machine so that I have full control over that machine. Or maybe I compromise that machine, but I don't have access or I don't have privileges on other machines in the network. Then how can I escalate my privileges to gain access to other machines in the network, right? So I like to separate these out or use two different terms for it. Lateral movement is not necessarily gaining more permissions, but moving around, right? So let's say maybe you get in as one user account and you have a limited number of things you can do, but then you can access this other user account that has other things they can do. And maybe you find another vulnerability that requires that user account that then gives you greater privileges, right? So moving to that other user wasn't necessarily gaining more privileges, but it was just moving to a different account. So that's an example of lateral movement. Privilege escalation is actually gaining more privileges through an attack that you run. Then after that, we have persistence. So again, I guess this can be optional depending on the attacker's goals, but persistence is what allows attackers to stay in for an extended period of time, right? So a lot of the times if you have this command and control or this terminal, in a way, session running on your target, if the defender or if the person using that machine were to just reboot, you would lose your session, right? So persistence is baking things into that machine so that you don't actually lose your session when things happen like a reboot. So that can be done in Windows, for example, with scheduled tasks. Scheduled tasks are basically you can run commands on a specific interval or when a specific event occurs. Another example is maybe an attacker puts a malicious service on your machine, a service that runs when the machine first starts up. So these are just a couple examples of persistence. And then the last piece is action on objectives. So the attackers have some objective, whether that's denying access to your system or exfiltrating data from your system, maybe gaining access to sensitive information. So the last stage of an attack is action on objectives. And so the interesting thing is, well, not the interesting thing, but as defenders, we want to be able to catch attackers in any of these stages, right? So that's why throughout the rest of this seminar series, we're going to take a look at each individual stage. We're going to take a look at some examples of what an attacker can do, and we're going to take a look at how, as defenders, we can catch them in that stage, right? And if you haven't heard of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, I'm putting a link to the MITRE ATT&CK framework down there. The MITRE ATT&CK framework is a much more, I guess, in-depth layout of the different stages of an attack. And under each stage, they give you different examples of things that an attacker could do. And if I go to one of these, like for example, under reconnaissance, we have gather victim network information, right? Then they give you, sometimes they have sub-techniques. So within that, what kind of information can an attacker gather? And then within each of those, they have detection, some mitigations, and also some examples of, in some cases, of attacker groups that have used this technique in the past and how exactly they used it and what tools they used, right? So the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a really useful framework. I would say even less for attackers, but more for defenders to have a good understanding of the different attack techniques that are out there, and how you would both detect and mitigate the vulnerability associated with that technique, right? So here's an example of some well-known attacker groups and what exactly they did that used this technique, right? And then part of being a defender too is not just kicking the attacker out, but understanding who is attacking you, right? What threats are you up against? And so frameworks like this are also helpful because if you see this tool was used, this technique was used, maybe you can actually map it to an attacker group, and then you have a better idea of what you're up against, and you can prepare yourself for future attacks from that group, for example. So I am skipping ahead a little bit, but okay. I promised you we'd take a closer look at command and control, or how attackers maintain persistent access to machines. So let's talk about it. What are the goals with command and control? And yes, as Lucas has kind of muttered, another term for command and control is C2 or CNC. I very rarely heard it called CNC. Most of the time I hear it called C2. But the goals with command and control are, one, we want to disguise the malicious traffic that we're sending back and forth with our target as legitimate, right? The reason we want to disguise it as legitimate is so that a defender who's sitting there monitoring network traffic, they don't see that something bad is going on, right? And then the second goal is to make that traffic as infrequent as possible. Because, for example, if you see a bunch of traffic between the attacker and victim machine as a defender, all happening at once, like a lot of traffic at once, that's kind of a red flag. Like, why is there a bunch of traffic to this one random website, let's say? But if you spread that traffic out, so maybe you do like one request every couple of days, then a defender who's looking at that is going to be like, oh, maybe somebody just is browsing to that page every so often. It's going to be less obvious that something is going on, right? So these are the goals that command and control addresses. How does it actually address those goals? Well, the first thing we do is we pick a legitimate protocol to target. So this goes with disguising malicious traffic to make it as legitimate as possible, right? So pretty much every organization, or most organizations at least, their employees are going to want to access the internet, right? Whether that's to actually browse the web or to just download updates or things like that, right? So how do we access the web? Well, the two protocols that are commonly associated with web traffic are DNS and HTTP or HTTPS. DNS is, like I mentioned before, how we resolve human-readable domain names like google.com into unique addresses, right? And then computers actually talk with those addresses in the end. And then HTTP is the actual web page content that you see is sent back and forth over HTTP. So as an attacker, why don't we take HTTP and just take all of our malicious data that we want to send back and forth, or all of the information we want to exchange, and just send it over HTTP, right? So if you're familiar with what HTTP looks like, and if you aren't, don't worry about it. We will be taking a look at this in a later session. But HTTP has GET requests, POST requests, patch, right, put, these different kinds of requests, right? And then within that, you have this URL parameter for what you actually want to get. Well, as an attacker, I could actually put the data that I want to exchange back and forth with the victim. I can put it in that URL parameter and maybe encode it in some way so that a defender who's monitoring network traffic is going to be like, oh, that's just a URL. but then the machine that I'm connected to will know to decode that and then maybe run that command that I told it to run, right? So the first thing we do is pick the legitimate protocol. And the second thing that I've already touched on is we wrap all traffic in that legitimate protocol, right? And then the last thing, how do we make traffic as infrequent as possible? We do nothing between requests for an extended period of time. The computer sciencey term for that is sleeping. So we sleep between requests. So the way it actually works in the end is, let's say I, as an attacker, want to run a command on my target. I will send a command to that target. That target will maybe run that command. It'll respond to me, and then that's it. And then it'll do nothing for maybe 2 days. And then the victim will reach out to me again and say, hey, do you want to do something else? Right? And then that process repeats. But as you can see, that process only repeats every so often. So a defender who's monitoring network traffic doesn't figure out that something weird is happening. In the end, I guess every attacker to do something bad on a machine, right, or on a piece of infrastructure, they have to run some malicious code, right? So what an attacker would do if they're using command and control is they would leverage some vulnerability, whether that's a malicious service or whether that's convincing a person to run malware, right? And then that malware or that vulnerability that allows them to run code, the code that they run would kick off this process, right? So they would run code basically that starts this command and control process of reaching out to you and seeing if you have anything you want to run, right, over one of these protocols like HTTPS or DNS. All right. I know that was a lot. Before we move on, any questions about what the attacker side of things looks like? And if you did CPC, oh my gosh, too many acronyms. If you did the penetration testing competition seminar series with me in the fall, then probably a lot of this is familiar to you, except maybe the command and control piece, because on a penetration test, you don't usually do command and control, but okay.
I think kind of a comment to mention Cobalt Strike.
Yes.
We've already talked about that.
So there are a lot of different frameworks that are commonly used to perform command and control. Some examples are like Cobalt Strike, Sliver, Havoc, right? There are a lot of them. But a lot of the times the attacker themselves doesn't write all of the code required for doing this command and control process. A lot of the times they leverage a pre-built framework that you can use to do this, right? So Cobalt Strike is an example of a paid one, and kind of the industry leader in command and control for a while. But Sliver is an example of a free one. But yeah, there are a lot of different command and control frameworks. Okay, so like we talked about before, every action that an attacker takes in each of those stages, whether that's reconnaissance, initial access, privilege escalation, all of that can be detected by defenders. How? Because everything that an attacker does leaves what's called an indicator of compromise, right? And we can find those indicators of compromise in three kind of places. We can find them in the network traffic, we could find them on the actual machines themselves, or we can find them on the applications of those machines. So when we're talking about network traffic, we can look at the source and destination IP addresses and ports, right? So if you do have this command and control process where an attacker is communicating with a victim, obviously traffic is going out to that IP, the IP address of the attacker, right? Or to the attacker's machine. Maybe that machine is in a geographic location that is not where most of your users are, right? So then you can figure out that something weird is going on. Then we have TCP or UDP headers. What service is the attacker trying to access? Maybe you see a bunch of connections to your SSH service, and you're like, that's weird. Why is there a bunch of traffic going to my SSH service from this source that doesn't usually connect to it, right? And then, of course, there's plain text service traffic for plain text services like SMTP or FTP, These are all services that the actual data that's exchanged between them, or that when you talk to them is exchanged in plain text. So that's another place. Also for websites, for HTTP, a lot of the times traffic is encrypted with what's called HTTPS, right? It's TLS encrypted. But maybe the organization does what's called SSL or TLS offloading, where rather than letting traffic go out to the internet, they actually have a server on the side that acts as a middleman, and so they can decrypt that HTTPS traffic and actually see what's going on there, right? So that's some examples of network. On the system side, once an attacker makes it on your machine, well, every time that every time that something gets run on your machine, a new process is spawned, right? Maybe the attacker created a new scheduled task or service. Maybe they uploaded, modified, or deleted a file. Maybe they exfiltrated, maybe they opened a file, right? And so that they could read it, right? Maybe they injected code into another already running process. So these are all things that we can see at the system level that may be indicators of an attacker's actions. And then the last piece is the applications themselves. So for example, like I talked about before, if we can see the actual requests that an attacker made to a web server, maybe we can figure out what vulnerability they're abusing to get in. Maybe we can see what queries they ran in a SQL database to see what data they pulled, right? Or maybe we can see what emails were sent and maybe find one that's a phishing email. So these are the three places where we have indicators of compromise: on the network side, the actual traffic, on the machine itself, and for the logs of the application running on that machine, right? Cool. So I wanted to show an example. And to do that, I'm going to take out my laser pointer. All right, so I do not take credit for this example or for this beautiful diagram. The actual source is right there, and I highly recommend checking out the blog post because it's really good. But let's take an example attack, Kerberosing. So for those of you who don't know what Kerberosing is, I'll dumb it down really quick. In Windows, there's this concept of Active Directory, which is what's used to manage users and groups and who has access to what, right? Now, the way that a user or a person actually authenticates to a service in Active Directory is through requesting tickets. And the actual way the protocol, I guess, for doing that is Kerberos, right? So whenever you want to access a service, you have to request a service ticket for that service. That's just what Windows kind of does in the background, right? And then from there you interact with that service. Now, each service is run by some account, right? So when you, for example, open Chrome on your laptop, your user is running the Chrome application. So if somebody's running like a MySQL service, right, there has to be some account that's actually running that service. And these service tickets that you use to authenticate to that service are encrypted with that service account's password hash, right? Basically, that service account's password. So the point is, what an attacker could do if they already have access to a Active Directory domain or to your network, they can request service tickets to different services, and then they can try different combinations of passwords and see if they can decrypt that service ticket. And if they're successful in decrypting that service ticket, they know that they have that account's password. I know that was a lot. Are there any questions about what Kerberosing is? Okay, well, I'll take that as a no. But let's take a look at how would an attacker perform Kerberosing. So one example is they could use the invoke Kerberos PowerShell tool, right? So thinking about that, let's say an attacker gained initial access to your internal network and is now performing Kerberosing. Well, maybe they're running invoke Kerberos in PowerShell on one of your machines. So how can you detect that? Well, you can detect that by looking for invoke Kerberos in the command line, right? To see if somebody ran invoke Kerberos. Okay, but let's say the attacker, instead of using PowerShell's invoke Kerberos, let's say they used a different tool. Like, let's say they used Rubius, the compiled version, right? So the actual .exe binary that does the same thing. Well, then at this point, maybe you'd have to look for both invoke Kerberos, or you'd have to look for any references to Rubius.exe, right? Now, as you can probably tell, this way of detecting an attack is falling short because there are an infinite number of tools, and even a slight change in the tool name or what the tool looks like will make that detection not work anymore, right? So maybe they, instead of naming it invoke Kerberos, they named it like invoke get service tickets, right? And then you wouldn't be able to detect it. So that's why we go one level up. Both of these tools, both PowerShell's invoke Kerberos and the compiled binary Rubius, if you actually look at the C# code, or the .NET, I guess, compiled code, they're both calling the same Kerberos requester security token function, right, in managed.NET, right? So maybe you actually put a detection on whenever that function is called, and now you'll be able to hello.
Hello. Oh, it's busy.
It is pretty busy. Hello. There are some chairs in back, or if you want.
How you doing? Come on, sit here.
If anybody wants to use the couch, you're welcome to use the couch.
Maybe we should think about getting a room.
I guess nobody's using the couch, so I'll move this back up.
Yeah, I'll have to get a room.
So, for example, if we put back to, I'm just going to jump right back into it. All right. So if we put the detection here for this on this function, well, this would catch both of these tools, right? However, there are other tools, like for example, Mimikatz, that don't necessarily use that function, right? So actually, these tools don't have to use Kerberos requester security token, because really what Kerberos requester security token does is it calls a different Windows API function, right? Initialize security context, right? So maybe it makes more sense to put our detection on initialize security context, and we can catch an attacker using this Kerberosing tool that way. But like I talked about before, there are other tools like Mimikatz, and those might use they might call a different Windows API function. So if we just put a detection on this, we might not catch other tools that call different Windows API functions to perform the same tasks. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this, that there are detections at different levels, right? So we can look at the tool, we can look at the actual function it's calling in managed code, we can look at the underlying Windows API function that's calling. We could actually look at the remote procedure call that performs when it calls that function. Or at the highest level, what does Kerberosing actually do? Well, in Kerberosing, you request a service ticket, right? And you try to crack that service ticket to obtain the person's password, right? So you could actually look for any ticket requests, right? Or any requests for service tickets. And that will guaranteed catch Kerberosing under all circumstances. However, the problem is requesting service tickets is also a very legitimate Windows thing. And so if you're just if you're alerting every time that a service ticket is requested, you're going to be flooded, your analysts are going to be flooded with tons of false positives, right? Or tons of benign service ticket requests. So the art of detection engineering, or developing these detections to alert when an attacker is performing an activity, is to kind of strike a balance of what level here do we want to put that detection, right? So that we catch as much malicious activity as possible, but so that we don't overwhelm our defenders with too many alerts that they have to investigate, right? So we might actually put a detection on multiple levels here. So we might maybe put an informational alert that talks about that ticket request. And maybe we'll put a very high level critical alert when we detect invoke Kerberos being run in PowerShell, right? And so I kind of wanted to point out, this goes back to what we were talking about before, about how we have these different places where we have indicators of compromise. And we can put detections at each of those places to try to catch an attacker, right? Okay, so we talked about indicators of compromise, but how do we actually collect that information? That information, or basically events that are happening in your environment, another term for that is telemetry. So that's why I'm calling this sources of telemetry. How do we actually get that information? Well, on the network side, you have your firewall or your proxy logs, right? So the firewall, usually in an organization, sits between the internal network and the external network. So if the attacker is attacking you remotely, like they're coming in from elsewhere, they're not an internal threat, all of the traffic that gets passed back and forth will be visible in the firewall logs, right? Or if you're using a proxy to route traffic before it actually goes out to the internet. So one example, like I mentioned before, is TLS offloading, right? If you're requiring all traffic that goes out to websites to go through that proxy, you'll also have those proxy logs to work off of. Then there's actual network traffic analysis. So the problem with looking at your firewall logs is, what if the attacker is doing things internally? How can you see traffic that's going on the internal network? And that's where network traffic analysis comes into play. And the biggest tool that's used for that is an intrusion detection system or an intrusion prevention system, like Snort or Suricata, right? And so with those, you can kind of do it in two ways. You can either passively monitor an interface or passively monitor your network traffic, or you could actually put it in between two machines that are communicating with each other in specific situations. So then you can block any traffic that is malicious, right, based on predefined rules. Anyway, that's the second place where we get this network telemetry, is through network traffic analysis. All right, looking at the system side, in Windows, we have Windows events or sysmon, right? So on your Windows machine, if I go to my event viewer, a lot of actions that take place on my Windows machine are actually logged here in these Windows logs, right? So for example, if I go to the security log, here I have a log of different actions that are taking place on my Windows machine. And this could be like maybe a user logged in or logged out. Maybe a file was accessed or modified, right? And so if I click on these logs, you can see I have the log information here, and I can even filter on these logs for specific event IDs. Event IDs is how Windows differentiates different actions. So a login would have a specific event ID, right? And individual applications will also have application logs, right? So for example, here are my logs for the OpenSSH service, which I don't think I'm actually running, so I don't think I'm going to have any logs here, but if I was running it, I would have logs for my OpenSSH service, right? So the problem is, as you probably saw there are tons and tons of different log files, and maybe collecting all of that log information would be overwhelming, right? And so we only want to focus on specific events that would be interesting to us as defenders, because they would be useful to collect to maybe fingerprint an attack, right? Or find an attack. That's where sysmon comes in. Sysmon is, I guess, an addition that you can install for collecting logs for specific events like file uploads and downloads, right? Or I guess file opens and file opening, or file creation and deletion, or scheduled task creation. All of those things that I talked about before or gave examples of, sysmon makes it really easy to collect that kind of information, right? In Linux, we have a similar sort of thing. We have the syslogs, like if in the var log directory, that are kind of, in a way, the equivalent of those Windows event logs. And there are additional services that you can install for better logging, like Audit D, for example, and you can fine tune what kind of events you log using that, right? And then the last piece we have, the problem with just relying on these logs is they may not be able to get into the nitty-gritty details of, like, for example, what libraries does a process load, right? Or what is there process injection, or like where one process is putting code into another process and running that code in another process, right? So just looking at process spawns or things like that is not going to get us that level of information. We need something that actually modifies, in a lot of cases, modifies how the underlying operating system works and actually kind of triggers on it to collect that information, right? And that I like to categorize as endpoint behavior, and that's done by endpoint detection and response systems, or EDR. So on the system side, that's where we get our information to catch attackers, right? Or those are our sources of telemetry. All right, and then on the application side, you have logs for individual applications. So for example, your email logs, especially if you're using a cloud provider, like maybe you're using Microsoft Azure, and in there you have your email logs, right? Also on-premise, right? Web server logs and database logs. So these are just some examples, but for applications, you can also have individual application logs that show specific interactions with that application. Any questions on sources of telemetry? All right, that brings me to our defense tech stack. So putting it all together, this is basically what you saw on the previous slide, except I'm highlighting the actual technologies that are implemented. So one is your IDS and IPS, that does your network monitoring, and the other one is your EDR, which monitors individual machines, right? And then the last thing I did is I combined the Windows events and sysmon and the Linux syslogs and Audit D, right? And I put them under this forwarder agent. Why did I do that? Because we have all these different sources of telemetry in different places, but as defenders, we need one centralized platform to be able to aggregate this information and decide what we want to do with it. And that's where we have security information and event management, or SIM systems, right? The purpose of a SIM is to aggregate those logs so you can search them and you can create those detections like the ones I was talking about earlier, right? And the way a SIM works is you actually, on each of your endpoints or each of your machines, you would install what's known as a forwarder that collects those logs and forwards them to your SIM, right? So you'd have your firewall or your proxy that would be forwarding its logs to the SIM. Your IDS IPS forwards its logs to the SIM. That forwarder or agent on each individual machine forwards your normal OS logs to the SIM. And you have that EDR that's doing that endpoint behavior that's also forwarding its logs to the SIM, right? And any individual applications you can choose to forward their logs to. So the SIM is that centralized place where we actually search those logs and we create detections. Then, in addition to SIM, we have a few more acronyms. One is SOAR, or Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response, I think. The purpose of SOAR is to kind of extend SIM and perform automated tasks with it, right? So maybe if you see some kind of malicious activity happening, you have this specific procedure of things that needs to happen in response to that. So SOAR would let you create those procedures. So that's automating response. Or maybe, let's say, you find evidence of what could be a potential attack, and there's a certain set of information that you want to collect to gain more information about it. You can also use SOAR to automate data collection, or like searching those logs and actually picking out the data that you need, right? And then the other kind of piece that we have along with SOAR is UBA, or User and Entity Behavior Analytics. The idea behind that is your users are probably going to be doing similar day-to-day job tasks each day, right? So your traffic or what's actually happening on each system is going to remain pretty constant, right? So UBA, the idea behind that is you baseline that normal behavior and you look for anomalies. So if you see, for example, oh, wait, somebody is trying to connect to my infrastructure from a completely different location that's not normal, well, then you can potentially catch an attacker that way. So that's UBA, taking a baseline of what normal behavior looks like and identifying anomalies. So in total, the ones in white, which is kind of hard to tell because the text is all similarly colored, but your IDS, IPS, your EDR, your SIM, SOAR, and UBA, that's going to be your actual defense tech stack that you're going to have in your environment as an organization. And I should mention, even though I put UBA as an extension of SIM or SOAR as an extension of SIM, it could also apply to an EDR, right? So an EDR might also be baselining normal behavior on a system and trying to identify anomalies, right? And maybe alerting on those anomalies. But keep in mind that an EDR can only see what's going on individual machines. It can't actually also see your network traffic. So that's why it's also important to have this SIM that looks both at what's going on the individual machines and the network traffic. The thing with the SIM, though, is all of these logs have to be forwarded to the SIM, which obviously it's a lot of data transfer, right? So there are certain things that you might not get as holistic a view of individual machines in your SIM as your EDR would get, because your EDR is sitting directly, it's running directly on each machine, right? So it can potentially collect more information, whereas transferring all that information to your SIM would exhaust the SIM, right? So I know that was like a lot of discussion about these different pieces and how they play together. Are there any questions about the defense tech stack?
Well, would
Go
it
for
be EDR having something like measuring the user's normal baseline and then only forwarding things that are abnormal to the SIEM? And I'm also like thinking about what examples there are for open source tools that do some of this.
Well, yeah. So actually, I can go over in our lab. I am using open source tools for all of this. Okay. So most of the network infrastructure, I'm using Security Onion. And Security Onion really just bundles other tools together and makes them really easy to set up with minimal effort.
No, because you have to use Palo Alto Network's Cortex XIM framework.
Oh, no.
Cortex XIO, and Cortex XDR. You have to
yes.
use them.
Well,
So
that's our training modules are on. Hey, but if we're able to
They
install...
better not be on any of those. They're just on the firewall.
yeah,
Oh, okay.
Palo
No, I thought you were
Alto.
kind of serious in terms of they would give those in the
No, I wish.
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be pretty cool. Palo
Those
Alto
are
is an example of a
expensive
firewall,
products.
right?
They're, like, very
And then
enterprise.
Cortex is an EDR. Yeah. Also, I should mention EDR. Sometimes you'll hear it called XDR. There's no like clear distinction between what EDR and XDR is. XDR stands for Extended Detection and Response.
I just thought XDR was Palo's funny little marketing.
Yeah, it's
Like
really
how they call it
a
XCM.
market. It's really a marketing tactic.
And XCM.
Yeah,
Actually, Palo calls it XIO.
of course they do.
And
No,
they have their
but-
own query language called XQL. I'm
That's
good at it.
amazing.
I know how to write it.
That's actually really funny.
It's the worst.
Yeah. So I like to consider EDR and XDR, to me, are basically the same thing. The idea is just like, oh, XDR can maybe do more. It has more extensive functionality than EDR. But what exactly that means is kind of open to interpretation, and each company will give you a different definition.
I'm sure, like having a separate like user UBA thing isn't very common. It's mostly just in the XDR.
Yeah.
Because Palo doesn't. I mean, they have XDR and it has a little bit of like UBA behavior, but it's
Mhm.
not. There's nothing outside that connects to SIAM.
Right.
SIAM. And then
True.
Normally
Yeah.
the SOC is just doing that. Like the SOC is identifying the baseline behavior themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. And that's why, like,
But it's
I kind of
the-
wanted to put
I
it there
like
as an
this.
extension of SIM, to just say that it could be an extension of SIM. But yes, a lot of the times it's usually EDR is naturally doing that stuff. And you could, like, there are extensions to Splunk, for example. Splunk has regular Splunk, which is your SIM, Splunk SOAR, which is your SOAR, and they also have a Yuba one that I'm forgetting what it's called now, but like it is an extension to Splunk that you can add if you wanted to. Yeah, I mean, we could look at it that way. True, but so in our lab environment, anyway, Security Onion, the IDS and IPS it uses under the hood is Suricata. You can actually choose between like Suricata and Zeek, but I'm choosing Suricata because it's like there's more you can do with it. A free EDR example, Wazoo. I still don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sure it's one of those. And when it comes to a SIM, I mean, Security Onion has its own SIM. So there's an example of a free tool for each of these. All right. And going back to so we already kind of talked about this, but I really wanted to hammer in this point and introduce a couple new terms, false positives and false negatives, right? False positives. So, okay, we're going back to talking about detections. So as a defender, you're going to sit there and you're going to look for these alerts that maybe something malicious is going on, right? And with those alerts could be true positive, true negative, false positive, or false negative, right? What does that mean? A false positive is when the alert was triggered, like maybe you were alerted on malicious activity, but it in fact was not malicious. A false negative is when there was malicious activity, but you didn't pick it up or you didn't get alerted on it, right? So when we're talking about how do we want to create detections, and what level of this chain do we want to put it at? We have to balance false positives with false negatives, right? Because if we're just looking for invoke Kerberos being run in PowerShell, for example, it's very likely that if somebody's running invoke Kerberos in PowerShell, it's almost certainly going to be evidence of an attack, right? Because a normal person wouldn't run invoke Kerberos in PowerShell. So you're going to have a low number of false positives, right? But there are going to be a lot of instances of an attacker performing a Kerberosing attack that this doesn't catch. So there's going to be a high number of false negatives, right? So on the precise side here, we have a low number of false positives, a high number of false negatives. The problem with having that high number of false negatives is we're missing a lot of an attacker's activity, right? Conversely, on the broad side of the spectrum, so down here, let's say we're monitoring all of those service ticket requests. Well, now we're going to catch every time an attacker does it, right? So we're going to have a low number of false negatives. So that kind of offsets the issue we had with being too precise. But conversely, we're going to have a high number of false positives. So there will be a lot of alerts on non-malicious or benign activity, right? And if an analyst is looking at these alerts that they're getting and then investigating them further, this will create what's called alert fatigue, where the analyst gets a lot of alerts. And if an analyst is getting a lot of the same alert, after a while, they're going to be used to it being a false positive and they're not going to investigate it as thoroughly, or they're not going to spend as much time on it because it keeps popping up all the time, right? So creating a good detection is about striking the balance. Where on this line do we want to put the detection so we have a certain amount of precision, but also a certain amount of broadness? So we balance our false positives and false negatives. And where we actually do this depends on individual organizational needs, right? So let's say you have a very, very small SOC team. You don't have the flexibility to have a high number of false positives, right? If you have a very small SOC team or a very small incident response team. Let's say you have a gigantic organization with a lot of people on the defense side. Maybe you can allow more high false positives to go through because you have more people to look at it, right? And you want to catch more things that an attacker is potentially doing, right? So based on organizational needs, that's how you determine where on the spectrum to put your detection. And that's a lot of what I'm going to focus in this seminar series. We're going to focus on how broad or narrow can we detect a specific attack. So we're going to run an attack And we're going to say, hey, look, we can put a detection here, or we could put a detection here, or maybe we'll do some combination of that, right? And again, this graphic I also did not make myself. It came from this awesome post by Spectre Ops, and you can check out the individual link to the original link to the post here. All right, other defenses that I didn't talk about, but I do want to briefly mention them so we have a full context into what the security landscape looks like. So we have threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is a proactive defense. So let's say other organizations that are in a similar business sector to yours are suffering this specific kind of attack, right? And let's say you haven't suffered that kind of attack yet, but you can talk to those organizations and be like, oh, it looks like attackers are doing this specific attack. Maybe I should implement some defenses or some detections proactively so that when an attacker tries to do it against me, I catch them, or like they're not able to do it. That's the idea behind threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is going out there and seeing what attacks are commonplace, what attack groups are targeting people that are in your sector in the industry, and proactively putting detections in place or fixing vulnerabilities or looking for those vulnerabilities to block those kinds of attacks, right? Then we have forensics. Forensics usually happens after an attack took place to figure out the extent of the damage, right? So let's say you know that an attacker is on this specific machine and they're doing things. Well, let's figure out how deeply they got into that machine. So then what you would do is you would make a copy of that machine's disk and its memory, analyze it in a different workstation that's in a contained environment, right? And then you could look in that disk in memory for indicators of what the attacker did, right? And so the idea behind that is, one, you can, if you don't have good backups of systems that attackers got into, then this way you might be able to go in and remove some of the persistence mechanisms that they had. Remember, persistence mechanisms is things attackers do to stay on that machine, right? Another thing is you could look for indicators of compromise on that machine that then you could hunt for elsewhere in your environment to figure out the extent of the attack, right? So that's forensics. And then the last piece related to malware specifically, we have antivirus. Antivirus performs static and dynamic analysis of malware. So when you have a malicious piece of code on your machine, right, before you run it, an antivirus can look at that code and it can say, oh, there's this string that's associated with common malware. I found it in that code, and so this is malicious. And so then it can flag on that, right? Or it can run that code in a contained environment, that's dynamic analysis, and see what that code is doing. Is it trying to reach out to the internet? Is it modifying a file, right? Is it modifying the Windows registry maybe? And then from there, it can make that determination of whether or not it's malicious, right? Now so a common example of AV is Windows Defender, which is on Windows machines by default, right? And at this point, back in the day, there used to be a really clear distinction between antivirus and EDR, which we talked about before, which does that actual analysis of things as they're occurring, right? Nowadays, it's become more blended together. Most antivirus solutions also do EDR-related stuff, so they also monitor your environment as things are running too, right? But they do perform this antivirus stuff as well, right? Then the other thing is, let's say you don't know if something is malware, or let's say you do have a known piece of malware. Somebody can actually go in and analyze that malware and find those indicators, or find specific pieces of that malware that separate it from normal pieces of code, right? So like maybe they find those special strings in that malware that malware relies on to run, right? And so then they can create rules, and the Yara is one common language used to write those rules that then antivirus solutions use to categorize malware, right? So a malware analyst would take a binary or a piece of code. They would figure out what it's actually doing, how it works. They would come up with some indicators for how you can identify whether it's malicious, right? Then they would write rules that antivirus can use to categorize new files that appear as malicious or not malicious. There's a point I wanted to make with that too, and I'm forgetting it. Any questions about these other pieces of the defense lifecycle that we have? All right. Okay. Now that we know how attackers get in, we know how defenders find that attackers get in, right? Now let's talk about the actual different roles in cybersecurity. So if you're interested in going into cybersecurity, on the defensive side, here are the biggest job roles. On the preventative side, we have threat intelligence analysis, right? So remember how I talked about threat intelligence is proactively looking at, researching what kinds of attacks are happening, taking that data, and then using that to then make decisions about how you're going to catch an attacker, right? And so a threat intelligence analyst would be the person who actually investigates current threats, who looks at maybe a platform where different organizations who are in the same industry sector share information about previous breaches, and different they can publish different indicators that they came up with, or different detection rules that they came up with. A threat intelligence analyst would take that information and decide what's important and relevant, right, for their organization. Then we have security engineering. This is the person, somebody has to actually develop and set up and maintain all this defense infrastructure that we talked about, like the SIMs, the EDR, the IDS IPS. And so the security engineer generally, although I've seen this term used pretty broadly, but generally a security engineer is going to be the person who manages that infrastructure. Then we have vulnerability management. So the idea behind a vulnerability manager is their goal is to minimize existing vulnerabilities as much as possible. And so generally they'd be in charge of running normal vulnerability checks, like for example, running scanners like Nessus or Nexpose on a regular basis, analyzing the results from those scans and deciding how to prioritize those vulnerabilities and which ones are the most important to fix, right? Then we have detection engineering. Detection engineering is actually developing those alerts or those rules, right? So that then when an attack does happen, we get alerted on the attacker's actions, right? These are all the different preventative areas of cyber defense.
I feel like you can also fit GRC in there.
Yeah, I didn't do like, there are other areas.
But that's like the big one. I feel like everything else is covered in that, because that's how I would describe like all of my coworkers as one of those. And GRC. Yeah. GRC is the last one. Right. So there I kind of like tried to put the most technical roles in here, yeah. But there's definitely like compliance, right? Trying to figure out whether you're meeting industry compliance requirements, right? If you're like a health organization, there's you know what? I'm not even going to bother. Lots of laws.
Yeah, there's lots of laws, right? So the law people, and also the law people are important in determining how you, especially when we come to incident response, how do you respond to that incident? Who do you have to notify? What will impact business, right? What can you actually do? Like, can you take machines offline? Or will that impact business? Like the shareholders and how we communicate this information with them, right? So yeah, so I guess GRC is the other kind of big category of cyber defense. Though here I was focusing more on the technical side of it. But yeah, that's an excellent point. And then on the detective side of things, we have SOC analysis. Those are the people who generally look at the alerts that they're receiving and respond to those alerts. So they'll figure out, generally the SOC analyst is the person who figures out whether that alert is actual evidence of malicious activity or whether it's something benign. And then they would go in and try to figure out the extent of the compromise, right? So that's a SOC analyst. But the thing is, whereas a SOC analyst primarily responds to alerts that were created by the detection engineers, right? A threat hunter is somebody who proactively goes in and looks at just maybe normal activity and sees if maybe there are any outliers. So this is where we were talking about UBA, right? Baselining normal activity and looking for any outliers. The threat hunter is kind of the person who serves that role, right? Or gives it a manual eye and sees if maybe they can catch something that wasn't alerted on. Then we have forensics, or the forensic analysts, right? They do the disk and memory exporting and then analysis to figure out the extent of the compromise on an individual machine, right? We have malware analysis, which is analyzing malware to understand its behavior and creating those rules for then antivirus to go in and flag malicious files. Also, I just remembered the point that I wanted to make before that I forgot, so I'm going to jump back a little bit. When we talk about static analysis, so looking for known malicious strings or known strings that are evidence of a piece of code that's malicious, right? That can happen both in the actual malicious file itself or in memory. So an antivirus can also analyze memory while it's running and look for indicators of like some kind of malicious string in memory. Anyway, sorry for jumping back and forth, but I just wanted to make that point. And then the last one on the corrective side, there's incident response. So an incident responder is somebody who addresses an active incident, right, and responds to it. In incident response, there's containment and there's eradication, right? So containment is making sure that if an attacker got in and you know that they're in, containing the attack as much as possible so the attacker can't move around. So if you can, you'd isolate individual machines off of the environment, right? Or kill network connectivity on those machines, right? Maybe you can't do that because those machines are required running for business purpose. So how you actually respond depends on your business needs, but containment, you contain the attacker as much as possible, and then eradication is actually trying to remove the attacker, right? And remove their persistence that they baked in. Because it's really, really difficult as a defender to find persistence mechanisms if an attacker does it well. Like there's so many different ways an attacker can bake themselves into a machine, right? Ideally, as an incident responder, you want to restore from a recent backup. That's the best way to know that your machine is going to be back to a known uncompromised state. Of course, if it was vulnerable, then you'd also have to address the vulnerability. But sometimes you also don't have a backup. You don't have a recent backup without losing necessary business information. So then you have to actually go in and try to remove all of the persistence mechanisms that an attacker left on the machine. And if it wasn't clear already, all of these roles, they all play together, right? So the threat intelligence analyst might proactively come up with or find threats that then you can create detection rules to detect if they attack you, right? They pass that to the detection engineers who create those detection rules. Then maybe the attacker tries to get in. The SOC analysts get alerted because of that detection rule that the detection engineer created, right? And then from there, now that they got alerted, then they can go to the incident response team and say, hey, we have an active incident and we need you to respond to it, right? And then after that attack happened, maybe they go in and they find that the attacker abused some kind of vulnerability. And so then they go to their vulnerability manager and they're like, oh, there's this vulnerability, we should prioritize it, right? So, and maybe to figure out the extent of the compromise, then they'll do a disk and memory capture of a machine and analyze that machine and figure out what else was there, right? So you can see how all of these different areas of defensive security all play together. And in smaller organizations that don't have as many people on the defense team, you'll have a few people performing a bunch of these roles, right? But as the organization gets larger, these roles get more separated out, and you'll have people who are actual experts in that individual role. Okay, we talked about the areas of defensive security. What about the areas of offensive security? Why do we have offensive security as a job in the first place, right? Well, the reason we have offensive security as a job is to proactively figure out or proactively make our environments more resilient to cyber attacks, right? Now, there are kind of three things that offensive security looks at. One thing that it looks at is identifying vulnerabilities that attackers are leveraging to get in the first place, right? So the individual vulnerabilities. The second piece of offensive security is identifying weakness in the detection rules and the response procedure of the organization, right? And the third piece of that is emulating an actual adversary. I put APT, which stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. Any kind of attacker that likes to stay in the environment for an extended period of time is called an Advanced Persistent Threat. Emulating a real-world adversary or a real-world attacker and seeing how your defenses react to that, like evaluating your overall security posture. Could the attacker get in? Were they able to move around? And were you able to detect them and respond to them? So these are the areas of offensive security that address each of those pieces. So penetration testing specifically looks for vulnerabilities in infrastructure, right? So a penetration tester is not going to try to be stealthy in the network. They're going to go in and they're going to run as many attacks as they can in a limited amount of time, right? And they're going to see how far they can get. And they're going to report on any vulnerabilities they found that they could take advantage of. And then the defense team would have the opportunity to go in and fix the environment. When we talk about types of penetration testing, we separate it out by the environment that the person is testing, right? So maybe they're testing an individual web application, so it's a web application penetration test, right? Maybe they're testing your internal environment, so it's an internal penetration test, right? Then purple teaming, which is what this seminar series is going to be about, instead of actually looking at those vulnerabilities, it looks at the detections, the actual detection rules that the organization has in place, and finds ways that you can maybe fill in gaps in those detection rules to better be able to find attackers, and also in response procedures. So maybe something only has a low-level detection and the response is minimal, but it needs to be addressed more because it's a common attack path that an attacker uses, right? That's what purple teaming is. And even though I put this as an area of offensive security, purple teaming is kind of a hybrid between the offense and the defense. In a purple team engagement, the attacker or the offensive security person will sit on call with the organization's defense team, right, and work with them. The attacker would run an attack, then the defense team would tell them, like, oh, we detected it, this is the level of the detection, this is our response. And then the attacker or consultant would offer suggestions on how to maybe change that detection or how to strengthen it, right? So that's what purple teaming is. And red teaming is when you are trying to be stealthy. You are trying to do exactly what a real-world attacker would do. A lot of the times an organization would know that there's this specific threat that has targeted other organizations similar to theirs, right? And so they want you to pretend to be that threat, use the same tools that those attackers are using, and see how the organization responds to it. And then the last piece that I didn't talk about, but just for the sake of filling this out, there's social engineering or tricking employees. So this involves sending out mass emails or texting employees or mailing employees or doing something to trick employees to either downloading a piece of malware or entering their credentials, right? So that's what a social engineer does. And the three biggest ways of doing, the three like most common types of social engineering are over email, over the phone, or physical. Any questions about the areas of defensive or offensive security? Cool. We are almost done with this presentation. Now I can finally talk about why you're here. So we already covered what is purple teaming. Remember when I started this presentation, I said I should probably define what purple teaming is, but I had to give you context. Well, I gave you the context. I defined purple teaming. Now we're going to talk about why I chose to do a seminar series in purple teaming specifically, other than because I'm doing it for work, which helps. But the goal here, the reason we're doing purple teaming is because there's something for everyone, no matter where you go in cybersecurity, right? If you go on the offensive side, well, we're going to actually be running attacks and showing the indicators of compromise, right? So as an attacker, you'll know some of the attacks that are out there, and you'll understand how to be a stealthy attacker, right? Like how you would minimize those indicators of compromise. If you decide to go on the defensive side, you're going to understand what it looks like to actually detect these attacks and how you might respond to them, how you would fix the underlying vulnerability, or how you would implement a detection rule to find that attack next time, right? So I really think that maybe if you're doing forensics, this might not be, or malware analysis, this seminar series might not be as applicable to you, but for most people going into cybersecurity as a job field, purple teaming has something for everyone. So what this seminar series is, purple team, right? So the first thing we're going to do, or what my goals for you is to give you a fundamental understanding of the attack and defense process. So here I gave you all the background knowledge that you need in this presentation, and next week we're going to start getting hands-on in a lab environment, right? And so you'll get to see individual attacks. We'll walk through each of those phases: reconnaissance, initial access, privilege escalation, persistence, command and control. I'll show you how to run the attack and how a defender might defend it, right? So you'll learn common attacks, indicators of compromise, and fixes, right? I'll show you how to implement detections at various levels, right? Finding the best balance between false positives and false negatives. Maybe not the best, but I'll talk about the different considerations that go into that, right? And lastly, hopefully this seminar series will help you be able to identify gaps in your organization's security, so that when you go to, maybe you become a defender for an organization, you can say, hey, like I saw this attack in this purple team presentation that I went to, and we don't actually have an alert for it. Or I can suggest maybe making a different severity alert for it, or responding to it in this way, right? So these are my hopes for you to get out of the seminar series, and that is why you're here. What the seminar series isn't, just so that it is super clear, I'm not giving you a comprehensive review of all the different attacks that are out there. If you're interested in taking more of an offensive look, check out CPTC in the fall. It's the Collegiate Penetration Testing Competition. I did a seminar series for that last semester, and I'm probably going to do another one this next semester. So be on the lookout for that if you're interested more in the attacks, specifically in the attacking side of things.
Super, super awesome seminar series as well. To throw in my own, recommendation. Super awesome. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Lucas. Last semester. I appreciate that.
The CPTC was really fun too. For anyone else who has questions about it, feel free to ask more.
Yeah, and we're gonna dominate next year, I'm sure. Both Niraj and Lucas were part of the CPTC team. Oh yeah, that's right.
But I'll attend this one.
You're welcome to still attend. Yeah, why not? It'll be my second time giving it, so it'll be much more curated, hopefully, than last time. This is not a detection engineering course. I just want to stress that if you do become a detection engineer, you're going to want to follow a continuous integration, proper development lifecycle, right? You're going to probably want to set up some kind of Git repository. You'll probably write your detections in kind of a code-like form, maybe using something like TOML, right? You're going to want to create a way of automatically validating those, testing those detections. We're not going to go through that whole development process for detection engineering. Though I will show you how to create these detections, right? And the sorts of things that you can detect, or where you might place those detections. But I just want to make it clear this is not a detection engineering course. And of course, this is not everything you need to know about cybersecurity. So all those areas like threat intelligence, malware analysis, forensics will not be covered here. All right. Are there any questions? I very much welcome questions about anything that I covered or about anything about what this is going to look like in the future.
How was the following sessions are going to be the hands-on sessions? What kind of tools will you be using?
Yes, so that's a good question. So, I am setting up a lab environment for you guys on our Cyberhawks servers in Proxmox. If you decide to stay after, this is totally optional, but I'm actually going to go over the entire lab environment and show you how I set it up in Proxmox because I know people were interested. But what that's going to mean for you, I haven't quite decided yet whether I want you to set up like your attacking VMs on your end or whether I'm going to provide that to you. But if you want to get ready, my recommendation is to set up one Kali Linux virtual machine and one Windows Server 2022 virtual machine. If you can set that up on a laptop, that would be perfect. If you can't, no big deal. Just let me know. And we do have enough resources now that I can provide each of you with an individual like attack machine that you can access in a web browser. So that's what you need. But if you're interested more in the actual defense tech stack and the environment setup, I'm going to talk about that in the follow-up to this presentation. But yeah, the defense tech stack is basically Security Onion. So all the default Security Onion stuff with Suricata. And I'm thinking of Wazoo, but I'm not entirely sure whether I want to do that yet because I've had so much trouble setting up the environment as is that maybe I'll do it, but that might be a later goal.
We're so thankful.
Yeah, so yeah, the goal with this environment is once I set it up, we're going to have it forever, and this is going to be the Cyberhawks lab. And so when we do CPTC in the fall, we're going to be using this environment again, right? So that's my goal with this, and we can keep adding to it, making it like kind of modular.
Yeah, and I was just going to throw out, I got it working again, but I've been using Waza for about like 3 or 4 months now, just on my own server. And then I've added like agents on my 3 devices. Like I have one on this laptop, my other laptop, and then my desktop, and then just one of my other servers. And it's kind of fun to work with dashboards.
Nice.
But like the parts I am stuck at with Waza is writing detection rules and also all the false positives. I think it'll say I have 140 vulnerabilities on my desktop. But so Waza is a really, really cool tool. But I am trying to figure out how to use this in CCDC, where it'd be actually useful. I'm thinking almost just like cutting out a ton of its stuff down to like 1 or 2 things we actually learn how to use really well. But yeah.
I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all their pre-built detections, and we're just going to start with nothing and just like create some basic ones. And again, we're not going to be creating detections for everything. We're only going to do like, I just want to give you the process and make you understand some example attacks and how we would detect them. My goal is not to like go through everything an attacker would do and put detection rules.
This one's cool. For the MITRE attack framework, it goes over like graphs of all the problems it's discovered in each area.
Yeah, maybe I really do want to install Wazoo. The only thing is I have to think of a smart way of installing the agent on like 30 machines or 20 machines, but I can use Ansible, which Go already uses. I would just have to write the Ansible script for it, which I can do. Docker?
No.
For the was it agent?
For the agents? Spins up a Docker instance of a Waza agent. No.
Put Docker in Docker.
Oh my god.
See, I don't even know if I'm using Docker on my home server for Waza. I think they just had a shell script installer or something. Oh, I've also forgotten the password too.
Yeah. And then the other thing is I would have to figure out how to integrate it with Security Onion, but I know it's possible because I've seen like Security Onion has built-in integrations for it, so it shouldn't be too difficult. I think they're both on the Elk stack, so yeah.
Yeah, and I can help with installing Muzza agents.
Do you want to help with? There's one lab environment that technically you're supposed to be able to auto between Packer, Terraform, and Ansible. Like in Goad, if you run the script, it's supposed to install it for you. But every single time I run it, I get a different error. And there was one time where it like almost fully installed, but then one of the Ansible scripts errored out. And then I redid it from scratch again because I didn't want to like those Ansible scripts, even though the idea behind Ansible is like, it's not supposed to redo changes that have already been done, but I didn't trust it. So I tried to reinstall it again. And the second time, it errored out when creating the VM. And so, oh my God, it's a mess. So if anybody wants to help me install one of our environments, it's not the most important because I'll talk about this more in a second, but I have Goad and then I have Goad's SCCM environment. And I thought it would be really cool to include their SCCM environment so we could do SCCM attacks because I have literally never done SCCM attacks. And that is like the one area of my knowledge where I am lacking. So if we don't install it, it's not the biggest deal, but I've had so much trouble with doing it. So yeah, if you're interested in helping out with that, let me know. I'd gladly hand that work to somebody else.
I'm just writing that down so that I can maybe Google and see if I might miss doing it.
Any other questions before I stop this first recording?
I put down a question for using the different layers here. Well, okay, I guess my question was like writing Kerberosting rules.
Sure.
What was that? So that would probably be a question that would take longer to answer then. But like if we were to go about writing a Kerberosting rules in WhatsApp, I'm wondering so I don't know the interface super
Actually,
well
don't
yet,
know WhatsApp that well, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. So then, no, that could be a later question. Maybe.
I mean, you bring up a good point, though, that I should probably mention. Rules, detection rules, when we're talking about detecting cyber attacks, they can be written in a few different places. They can be written for the IDS IPS, they could be written for the EDR, or they could be written for the SIM, right? So remember, each has its own advantages. So the IDS IPS is the closest you get to the actual network traffic, right? So if you want to block specific network traffic based on rules, or you want to get alerted right away when some traffic happens on your network, you put the rule in the IDS IPS, right? If EDR has the best visibility to your endpoints, also known as your machines, right? So if you want to detect a piece of malware or something, or detect an action that an attacker is taking directly on a machine, you can put the detection rule in the EDR, and that'll detect it immediately or block it immediately, right? The SIM can combine things from your network and from your systems, but it doesn't have as close a visibility into each of them. So if you want a more holistic detection rule, that's like, oh, maybe we're combining that an attacker both ran Kerberos and there was a TGS request, right? Maybe it's combining those pieces of information, then you could put a detection on the SIM. I just want to make that point.
So the most efficient way is putting the detection rules on the SIM, right?
Well, not necessarily. It depends what you're looking for. I mean, if you put a detection on the SIM, how would you detect malware, right? I mean, if you would eventually detect malware, like maybe it would, the things that the malware does would be forwarded to the SIM and then you detect it. But at that point, the malware already ran. So it's helpful to have an EDR that will right away snipe the malware, right? Because remember, all of these, the SIM gets its information from these places, but these places have to forward their logs to the SIM, which takes time. And logs are only forwarded every so often, right? So you won't get that alert immediately, whereas if you put it directly on the IDS IPS or the EDR, you will get that alert immediately.
So when you get the alert immediately, you won't have to look at the SIM.
If you find the alert in your EDR dashboard, then you've already caught it before it even reached the SIM, right? But then here's the thing, an attacker is not just going to do one thing. They're not just going to run malware and then do nothing else, right? They'll probably run malware and then they'll maybe do some network attack and then maybe do something else. So if you want to map out the attacker's entire attack path, that's where it's helpful to have the SIM. So you can correlate different pieces with each other and help map out the attack path. Yeah.